How can studying Bible backgrounds help us to better understand that tricky passage in Romans 7? Well, today we continue our conversation with Dr. Craig Keener on the Bible Backgrounds podcast. My name is Dr. Kurt Jarris, your host. Welcome to the Bible Backgrounds podcast with Dr. Craig Keener. Dr. Keener is the F.M. and Ada Thompson Professor of Biblical Studies at Asbury Theological Seminary here in Wilmore, Kentucky, and I am very excited that we get to continue our conversation today, Dr. Keener, as we look at this head-scratcher of a passage, Romans 7, and trying to figure out what did Paul mean exactly when he uses these terms, because when we read Romans from start to finish, we can see that Paul's already dealt with sin and how we should sin no more, and he talks about how he's in bondage to sin. There was a time when he was alive when there was no law, and these sorts of things just don't make sense when we think about Paul, the converted Christian. So he's certainly doing something else. And last week we discussed the different positions on that, the different interpretations. Today I want to ask you more about the backgrounds to this and how we can glean from what was around to understand what Paul meant. And even before we get to Greco-Roman sources, I want to start first by asking you about the church fathers and the different interpretations that they had. Are they able to offer us something for how we should understand Paul in Romans 7?
Well, the different interpretations today actually are not new. The church fathers also had different interpretations of this. And the Greek fathers, who emphasized free will a lot, mainly because they were combating determinism, whereas Augustine, the later Augustine anyway, is emphasizing a predestinarian approach more because he's combating Manichaeans and stuff like that. So, I mean, the way we argue is sometimes shaped by, or at least related to, the issues that we're addressing. And that was the case with Paul as well. But the Greek church fathers, they generally did not see this as the Christian life. Certainly didn't see it as Paul's life. All the idea of saints and so on. I mean, Romans 7 is not describing somebody who's facing temptation and sometimes winning. Romans 7 is depicting somebody who's facing temptation and always losing. So they said this is not the Christian life. And I think that they probably picked up on the hyperbolic character of it. There's a certain degree where you could caricature certain things. That was standard part of rhetoric. But also they often saw it in terms of prosopopoeia. He's speaking in somebody else's. I think Origen saw it actually as the person who's in between being converted. They haven't been baptized yet.
Interesting.
So they're not really fully converted. Origen, actually in Romans 6, he says that once he remembers that he's dead with Christ to sin, immediately the temptation vanishes. So he was like reckoning himself dead to sin. Origen, the way he dealt with narrative was really weird. And some of his doctrines, at least in later form, were really weird. But in Romans, he actually does some good stuff. I mean, he sees it, the Jewish-Gentile issues in Romans, and maybe it's just the selections of Origen I've read, but he actually has some good ideas there. Now, Augustine, he's battling Pelagians. And so Pelagius was like, even in our own human nature, of course God gave us that human nature, but in our own human nature, we're able to choose to do what's right. It may not have been taking the fall seriously enough, that human nature we've been sinning for a long time. So that's affected our nature, and we need grace to overcome it. And I don't know that he would have said we don't need grace, but anyway, Augustine went after him and was saying we can't do anything good in ourselves. we need God to enable us to do it. I think Augustine had the better case on this. But Augustine saw Romans 7 as Christian life. He faced temptation. He sees Paul as facing temptation. Well, it is true we face temptation. In the garden at Gethsemane, Jesus says to his disciples, "Watch and pray lest you succumb to temptation." And what did his disciples do? Did they watch and pray? No, they went to sleep. Temptation came, they fell. They abandoned him and fled, and Peter ended up denying him. Jesus, by contrast, did watch and pray in his time of testing, and he was ready. So we do face testing, but this idea of continuous defeat in Romans 7, I think, is beyond that. So, but Luther and Calvin followed Augustine's view. I mean, Luther was an Augustinian monk. Augustine gave him the kind of the blueprint for, well, actually he got it not just from Augustine, but Augustine gave him this emphasis on grace, very big in Calvin too. Not that nobody else thought about it, but Romans 7 dominated some of those views. The Armenians tended to go back to the Greek church fathers and approach it differently. Today, among biblical scholars, most biblical scholars do not think that this was Paul's current life. Most of them don't even think it was his former life, although some of them do. The majority think of it as just life under the law, portraying that generally. In terms of how I would see it as life under the law. And maybe Paul is able to identify with some of this because he had experienced that, but it's only from his Christian vantage point looking back that he can see. I mean, when I was converted, it wasn't from a life under the law. I was pretty much all in for sin, at least mental sin. I was too young to get away with some other things, but and I would have gotten arrested too. But yeah, trying to take over the world. Yeah. Anyway, we won't go into all the details. But
I'll be Pinky. You'll be the brain. You know that old animated cartoon.
So I was not under the law, but yeah, the transformation was pretty total. I mean, a lot more to go, but even with the joy that I experienced in Christ, of being able to let go of worry about mortality. I could say, for example, but that was a big one with me. I'd never experienced joy like that before in my life. I'd been happy sometimes, but I had never, I hadn't had that to compare it to. But when I became a Christian, I was like, whoa, what I have now, there's no comparison what I had before.
And even for non-believers, the passions are still there. Now, maybe they're not battled against or fought against, whereas with Romans 7, there's this depiction of a battle, of a war within the body.
Yeah, because now it's talking to people under the law who know right from wrong.
Yeah.
Whereas in Romans 1, maybe they have some concept of right and wrong, but, you know...
But the passions are still working. They're still doing their thing.
Yeah.
Folks are, for a common parlance, folks are trying to chase tail, if you will, the sexual pursuits. So they're still doing those things.
Coveting is forbidden in the law. Coveting is something that hits most of us somewhere. But in Greek culture at this time, it changed considerably after Christian impact, but Greek culture at this time, lust wasn't considered bad. And for guys, sleeping around wasn't considered bad. So nothing to feel guilty about, culturally speaking, even though you may be exploiting the people you're sleeping with.
I've have a little bit of an interest in archaeology, and Pompeii is this city where it was just consumed with volcanic ash, and most of it was preserved as a result. And as archaeologists have been uncovering, getting back to sort of how what was acceptable for men, in their roads there were phalluses carved into rocks to point to where the brothel was, so they would know the way to the prostitutes. I mean, so it really was ingrained in the culture, and it wasn't looked down upon. It wasn't, people weren't ashamed of it. It's just what they did.
Greeks also used the phallus on the herme, which when I was 13 reading Aristophanes, I got the joke in his Lysistrata about that. But in Pompeii, I mean, they would also have sometimes pictures of the different prostitutes on the side of the brothel, and the respective prices for each. And the ones that were considered more beautiful, you'd pay more for. So, and there were the high-class prostitutes, the heterae, but the majority of prostitutes were slaves. So just total exploitation. Paul speaks in Romans 1 of defiling their own bodies, but also the exploitation of others involved in that a lot of people just didn't think about.
So when we look at Romans 7 and we see Paul's use of the passions, the desires of the flesh, do we see even that term, desires of the flesh, or do we see similar concepts in other Greco-Roman philosophical groups or even thinkers? For example, like do the Stoics talk about it?
Stoics were materialists. So when they would speak of the spirit was just a very fine form of matter that pervaded everything. Platonists were dualists. So they would see matter versus like the soul. And Paul actually, interestingly, Paul never uses psyche, the soul, in the Platonic way. I was surprised when I saw that. I mean, he does differentiate between, say, our spirit and our body. He doesn't use body, soma, and flesh, sarx, exactly interchangeably, but he does use them sometimes interchangeably, more than some modern scholars have wanted to admit, wanting Paul to be holistic in the modern way. He's addressing a first century culture. Let him be Paul. They're wanting to read the Old Testament into Paul, but Paul is addressing, so Paul still keeps the Old Testament back. Actually, you probably want me to deal with the Greek stuff first. So, but my mind is going right away to Paul's Old Testament background. Is it all right if I?
Sure.
So, in the Old Testament, you have this language of spirit and flesh. Well, you have all sorts of things. I mean, love God with your whole heart and soul and might and so on. But spirit and flesh, you've got in Isaiah with the parallelism, the Egyptians are humans and not God. Their horses are flesh and not spirit. But it especially goes back to Genesis 6:3, which was, elaborated all over the place in Second Temple Judaism. There was a big thing with the sons of God going into the daughters of man, I think in verse 4. So, but in verse earlier there, you have God saying, "My spirit will not always strive with humanity because they're just flesh." So it's a contrast between God's spirit and humans as flesh, which is the same thing that's said about other creatures. All flesh, in which was the breath of life, was destroyed in the flood and Genesis and so forth. So that carries over the idea of the weakness of the flesh, carries over in this period. You have it in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Qumran Scrolls, where humans are basar, flesh. But it's taken on connotations not just of creatureliness, mortality, weakness in general, but now also more specifically vulnerability to sin. We are weak, we're mortal, we're vulnerable to all sorts of things, including sin. And Paul uses it that way. Humanity, us by ourselves, if we're just flesh, left to ourselves, we're vulnerable to sin. And the body, it can be good or bad in Paul. It can be used for good. So, present your bodies as living sacrifices, Romans 12. Present your bodies for God as hopla, maybe weapons for God or instruments for God in Romans 6. But, Romans 1, they defiled their bodies. They made their bodies impure by the impure things they did. So it's not the body per se. God created us and said it's very good. But it's when we let the passions of our body, which can be good, run things. Instead of our executive function saying,
don't do that.
Don't do that one. No, don't use it that way. I'm hungry. That's good, but gluttony, no. I'm passionate. Okay, hopefully your spouse is in the same mood and you can go do something. But exploiting a slave prostitute, that's not good. And so, or exploiting a slave, I mean, the things that were done were just, if I would go into that and elaborate on some of that, but I mean, people do the same things today. They use other people sexually and whatever. So the passion, if we didn't have sexual passion, the human race would have died out a long time ago. If we didn't have desire for food, we individually probably would have died out a long time ago. If my stomach didn't remind me I'm hungry, when I'm studying, I would probably starve. So we need those, but we need to have them under control, that we can use them in the right ways.
So getting back to Greco-Roman thinkers and desires of the flesh, the passions, what did they have to say, and was that different from Paul?
Well, they were also different from one another to some degree. Like Stoics talked about eradicating the passions. Like you could actually do away with them, and other people made fun of them for that. Aristotle said, no, you need the mean between this and that. You don't want extremes. But most ancient philosophers said, yeah, the passions are bad. They often would associate them with our materiality, especially Platonists. But, if you actually asked a Stoic, so, you've eradicated your passions, huh? The Stoic would normally answer, I'm not there yet, I'm in process. So, again, they'd speak in ideal terms. Well, the wise person is completely wise, and the foolish person is completely foolish. But you actually look at humanity, okay, well, this person's somewhere in between. And Proverbs does that, righteous versus the wicked, the wise versus the foolish. Most people have some sort of mixture. But this was a form of rhetoric that was understood, where you speak in terms of ideal types. And that also helps explain some of the paradox in 1 John, where you have, I write these things to you so you don't sin, but if anyone does sin, and then earlier in 1 John, if you say you have no sin, you're a liar, the truth is not in you. And then later in 1 John, if you're in, I'm using Pauline language now, I'm thinking Paul, but 1 John 3:6, 3:9, and so forth, you've experienced Christ, you won't sin. And sometimes people try to make that based on verb tenses, but it's, there's a paradox there. We have a new nature. God's seed is in us, to use the language of 1 John 3, 1 Peter 1:23, and so forth. But yeah, anyway, I digress a lot. Sorry.
No worries. Well, let's take a question from one of your online followers, Philip. Mm-hmm. He writes, "Dear Professor Keener, I have a hypothetical question about the end of the Old Covenant and the beginning of the New. For a faithful Jew that lived in rural Israel in the first century and did not hear anything about Jesus before he died, perhaps in 35 AD, I know some say, 30, 33 for Jesus himself, for this individual," so I guess he's saying for 35 AD, for this individual, was this individual saved by his Jewish faith in the Old Covenant or lost because he failed to receive forgiveness in Christ under the New Covenant?
This is such a superb question that I don't actually know the answer. I've been, ever since my conversion, I was trying to figure this out. But I have thought about it, and so it is interesting in John chapter 1, when actually somebody named Philip is there, and he witnesses to his friend Nathanael. He says, oh, Jesus is the Messiah. We found the Messiah. And Nathanael says, well, can any good thing come out of Nazareth? And he says, come and see. So he comes, he experiences Jesus for himself, and when Jesus sees him coming, he says, now here is a genuine Israelite in whom there's no guile. So this is somebody who was already on the right track. And in John's gospel, like those who love the truth, they'll come to the light. So there's some people who react against the light. They already have that predisposition. Some are drawn to the light because they have that predisposition. So I think there were some who were already in process. Now, don't ask me where the cutoff is. Well, that's what you're asking, but I don't know the answer to that.
Right, yeah. Well, God knows, I would think.
That's the important thing.
Yeah, very intriguing question, Philip, and I know it also gets a part of the issue of the problem of the unevangelized, and so it's sort of, that's a hypothetical I've seen Roger Olson use as a case study, if you will, and see if you can draw out from that, looking at the problem of the unevangelized. And
yeah, that one's somewhat different because, asking about the Old Covenant, you're asking about people who were trying to follow God's revelation.
Right.
Whereas, Romans 1 is...
Right, so my point is, if the person following the Old Covenant won't be saved, right, then the unevangelized surely won't be.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's related broadly to that conversation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. Very superb.
I was thinking of it the other way, but yeah.
As Dr. Keener said, a superbly worded question, Philip. Thank you for your submission. If you want to learn more about Dr. Keener's journey, you can look at his treasure trove of resources. Head on over to craigkeener.com. There you can subscribe to his website and find articles, blog posts, videos, and even his cartoons. At his site, you can subscribe to receive email updates. You can also follow Dr. Keener on Facebook, Twitter, and his YouTube channel. But if you want to see the latest videos of the Bible Backgrounds podcast before everybody else does, go to apologetics315.com. At that site, you can see Dr. Keener's video channel, and if you subscribe to his AP315 video channel, you can be entered to win the IVP Bible Backgrounds Commentary New Testament signed by Dr. Keener. After this season is completed, we'll select a winner, so go to apologetics315.com, click on videos, and subscribe to Dr. Keener's channel.